The first thing Fleet Marshal Voreth noticed was the silence. Not the silence of empty space. She had lived in that silence for 60 years. This was different. This was the silence of a communications array that should have been screaming. 43 ships. The Keth Dominion's third expeditionary armada. 7 hours ago, they had crossed into the buffer zone between Keth-controlled space and the quarantine corridor humanity called the Shepherd's Line. The armada had transmitted routine position markers every 12 minutes for the first 4 hours. Then the markers stopped. Not interrupted, not scrambled, not cut short mid-transmission. They simply stopped, as though the ships had decided, collectively, to go quiet. Voreth stared at the dead frequency indicator on her console. The light that should have been pulsing green sat flat in amber, the color her people used for signals that had not merely failed but had ceased to exist. She pulled up the last recorded transmission. The timestamp read 04-1709 standard. The message itself was 6 words. Contact. They are already hold on. In the 14 months since humanity had formally entered the Galactic Compact as a provisional member species, the prevailing consensus among the 31 recognized civilizations had been some variation of the same assessment. Humans were interesting. Humans were resilient. Humans were, in the way that certain organisms on their own planet were capable of surviving fires and floods and mass extinctions, possessed of a certain stubborn biological persistence that bordered on the impressive. But they were not, the consensus agreed, dangerous. The Keth Dominion had filed formal objections to human membership from the first session. They had presented population modeling, resource projection, territorial expansion probability matrices. They had stood before the Compact Assembly and stated, in terms designed to be irrefutable, that admitting humanity to the Compact was equivalent to inviting an unquarantined contagion into a sterile environment. The humans were young. They were loud. They were emotionally unstable in ways that made their decision-making structurally unpredictable. The Compact had voted 30-1 in favor of provisional membership anyway. The Keth had decided, with the patience of a civilization that had been arranging the outcomes of lesser species for 400 years, to simply resolve the matter themselves. The third expeditionary armada had not been a military action, not officially. It had been a demonstration. 43 warships crossing into the buffer zone, not to attack, but to position. To make the geometry of the situation clear to humanity in a language that even young, emotional, structurally unpredictable species could understand. The language of overwhelming force. The 43 ships had crossed the Shepherd's Line at 23:45:00 standard. By 04:17:09 they had stopped transmitting. Voreth was still staring at the amber light when her communications officer, a young male named Saravith, turned from his station with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Fleet Marshal. His voice was careful in the way voices become careful when the speaker is not certain the words they are about to say are real. We are receiving a transmission, single channel, type beam directed specifically at this vessel. From the Armada? No, he paused. From a human. The message was audio only. No visual component, no metadata signature, no origin coordinates. It arrived on a frequency the Keth military did not publish, had never shared with any external civilization, and had considered effectively undetectable. Someone had found it anyway. The voice was female. Calm, low, in the register humans used when they were being deliberate. It spoke in Keth standard, not translated Keth standard, not the approximated phonetic Keth standard that the Compact's translation matrices produced, but actual Keth standard, with correct grammatical recursion and proper tonal stress on the third syllable of honorific forms, which took most linguists years to master. Fleet Marshal Voreth. My name is General Adiz Akafer. I command the human forces currently operating in the buffer zone. I want to begin this conversation by being honest with you because I think we've had enough dishonesty in the last 48 hours to last both our species a generation. Voreth said nothing. She nodded at Saravith to keep the channel open. Your armada is not destroyed, the voice continued. Your crews are alive, every single one of them. I want you to understand that was a choice we made, not a limitation we operated under. I need you to understand the difference between those two things before we go any further. Vorith felt something move through her chest that her species did not have a precise word for. The closest approximation in Keth was vorsethic, the sensation of standing at a great height and suddenly becoming aware of exactly how far the fall would be. "What do you want?" Vorith asked. "To talk," the human said. "Just talk. I think, Fleet Marshal, that there are some things about us that your people have fundamentally misunderstood, and I would rather explain them to you now than demonstrate them again later. I suspect the demonstration gets considerably less pleasant from here." The amber light on Vorith's console had not changed. She thought about 43 ships. She thought about 6 words and a cut transmission. She thought about the fact that humanity had found her private command frequency, addressed her by name, and was now offering her, with no apparent hostility, a conversation. "Talk," Vorith said. General Adiz Akafer was 44 years old. She had been born in Lagos, Nigeria, on a planet called Earth that the Keth Dominion's files described as a Class M biosphere with moderate military potential and negligible strategic projection capability. She had spent 22 years in the Nigerian army before the Compact Contact event reorganized Earth's defensive architecture into something called the United Earth Defense Compact, which the Keth files also had on record as a poorly funded interplanetary defense organization with an inventory of ships that were, by Dominion standards, functionally antique. She was currently sitting in the command compartment of one of those antique ships, a vessel called the Abuja, which had been commissioned 14 years ago and refitted twice with technology that the Keth would have considered adequate for a border patrol corvette. Round her, 7 other vessels of similar vintage held position in a formation that the Keth's tactical analysis software, when it eventually processed the geometry, would spend 11 minutes trying to classify before flagging the formation as non-standard, no tactical analog found in database. There were a great many things about the last 48 hours that the Keth's databases had no analog for. "How long have you been planning this?" Vorith's voice came through the channel with minimal distortion. "The Keth had excellent communications technology. Planning to talk to you," Adiz asked. "About 6 hours. Planning to intercept the Armada." Adiz was quiet for a moment. Outside the viewport, the buffer zone was dark. No stars in that direction. The shepherd's line ran along a dusk corridor that absorbed light beautifully, which was part of why humanity had chosen it. "The Armada announced itself 14 days ago," she said finally. "Not to us directly. But when 43 Keth warships begin accelerating toward a specific vector, there are ways to notice. We had time to prepare." "You had 8 ships," Vorith said. The words carried something that Adiz recognized as the sound of a very intelligent person trying to understand something that should not be real. "We had 43. Yes. Your vessels are, our analysis classified them as outdated. Yes, we know." Adiz leaned back in her chair. It was an old chair, fabric-covered, slightly worn at the armrests. She had been sitting in it for 31 hours. "I'd like to tell you something, Fleet Marshal, if you'll let me. Something we don't usually explain to people before the shooting starts because we don't usually get this kind of conversation. Would that be all right?" A pause. Then, "Continue. Every single person aboard these 8 ships volunteered. I didn't draft them. I didn't order them here. I opened a channel to the 4 nearest defense stations, and I explained the situation: 43 Keth warships, buffer zone, no backup within viable response range, and I asked for volunteers. I had 4 times the crew I needed within 2 hours. Silence on the channel. "I'm telling you this," Adiz said, "not to make a point about human bravery, because that's not really what this is about. I'm telling you this so that you understand what the number 43 means to a human and what it means to one of my crew members, because I think that difference is the thing your people keep missing." Vorith pulled up the Armada status report for the 4th time. Her analysts had been working the problem since the transmission stopped, and they had managed, through a combination of passive sensor sweeps and careful frequency scanning, to establish that the 43 ships were physically present in the buffer zone. Their drives were cold. Their weapon systems were offline. Their communications were, and this was the part that kept generating errors in her analysis software, not jammed, not destroyed, not encrypted. They were transmitting normally. The crew members were alive, uninjured, and had, apparently, voluntarily ceased military operations. That last conclusion had been flagged by the software as low confidence, conclusion unsupported by behavioral model. Adi's voice continued on the channel, and Vorath found herself doing something she had not done in 20 years of command, listening without simultaneously formulating a counter-response. The number 43 to your tactical planners means a 43 to 8 force advantage. It means a tonnage ratio. It means weapon yield and shield capacity and interdiction probability. All of that math is correct, by the way. On paper, the Armada should have crossed the buffer zone without losing a single ship. And yet, Vorath said quietly, and yet, Adi's voice did not carry triumph. It carried something that Vorath's linguistic analysis subroutine flagged as exhaustion mixed with something the database cannot classify. The number 43 to my crew means 43 ships full of people. It means families. It means people who went asleep last night not knowing that a human general was going to make a very complicated decision about what winning actually looks like. The channel was quiet for 7 seconds. "Where are my people?" Vorath asked. "Exactly where they were. We didn't board them. We didn't capture them. We didn't fire a single weapon, Fleet Marshal. We just convinced their captains that continuing forward was not in anyone's interest." A pause. "I'd rather not explain exactly how we did that if you don't mind. Some of it, honestly, I wouldn't know how to explain even if I wanted to." This was the third thing Vorath had failed to understand about the last 7 hours, and unlike the first two, this one did not generate an error code in her analysis software. It generated something worse. It generated a question. 41 hours earlier, Flag Captain Drevik of the Keth cruiser Severing Tide had been standing at his forward observation station when his tactical officer reported contact. Not weapon contact. Not drive signature contact. Something his tactical officer described with visible uncertainty as communication contact. "They're hailing us," the tactical officer said. Drevik had not been concerned. One ship. The humans had sent one ship ahead of the buffer line, a vessel his analysis team classified as a light courier with no significant armament. It was, he had noted, either a gesture of negotiation or an act of profound ignorance regarding the scale of force they were facing. He accepted the hail. The woman on the screen had close-cropped hair, dark skin, and the kind of stillness in her expression that Drevik associated not with calm but with a person who had made a decision they were completely at peace with. She was wearing a uniform with no decorations on it, just rank insignia and a name tag. "Flag Captain Drevik," she said, in Keth standard that was frankly better than some of his own junior officers. "I'm General Akaffer. I'd like about 10 minutes of your time." "General," he said carefully, "you are aware of the force you are facing." "I am, and you have sent one ship." "Yes." She folded her hands on the table in front of her. "That's the conversation I'd like to have with you, actually. Not the part where I ask you to turn around. I'm not going to insult your intelligence with that. I want to talk about what happens if you don't." Drevik had, in 40 years of command, never had a conversation quite like the one that followed. He had reviewed it twice in the hours since, and he was still not certain he understood all of it. The general had not threatened him. She had not described weapons or strategies or numerical advantages. She had told him a story. It was a story about a war humanity had fought 300 years ago on their own planet. A war that had lasted 4 years and killed 60 million people. She described it without emotion in the tone of a person relaying historical data, and she had stopped at a particular moment, a specific battle, a specific city, a specific winter, and she had said quietly, "Do you know what we learned from that as a species?" Drevik had said he did not. "We learned," she said, "that there is a kind of human being who performs better under worse conditions. Not most humans, but enough. When you remove all hope of survival, when you make it absolutely clear that the objective cannot be achieved and the odds cannot be overcome, a small percentage of humans stop calculating. They stop asking whether they can win. They start doing something else entirely." "What do they do?" Drevik had asked without intending to. "They start asking how much damage they can do on the way out." She met his eyes through the screen. "Flag Captain, I have 8 ships. You have 43. We both know what the math says. I'm asking you to also consider what happens when 8 ships worth of people stop caring about the math." He had dismissed her. He had continued the advance. He had reported the contact to Fleet Marshal Vorath as a minor irregularity, a human psychological operation, almost certainly theater. 6 hours later, 43 ships sat cold and dark in the buffer zone, their crews alive and unharmed, their captains having each, independently, reached the same conclusion. Vorith understood now why the transmissions had stopped the way they did. They had not been cut off. The captains had simply stopped transmitting because there was nothing to report. No engagement, no damage, no enemy contact in any conventional sense. Just a series of conversations, apparently, that had ended with 43 commanding officers deciding, each in their own time, that forward motion was not something they were willing to authorize. The compact would later classify this as the first recorded instance of what their analysts termed asymmetric social interdiction, a military action conducted entirely through communication, without a single weapon discharge, that achieved complete mission failure for a superior force through mechanisms that the Dominion's behavioral modeling software could not retroactively predict or explain. But that classification was weeks away. In this moment, Vorith was operating with raw data and a growing sensation that the floor beneath her had shifted at some point in the last 7 hours, and she had only now noticed. General Akaffer, she chose the words carefully. I want to ask you something directly. Please. What do you want us to do? Not what are you demanding. I understand you haven't issued demands. What is it that you actually want from this conversation? The pause that followed lasted longer than any of the previous ones. Vorith found herself holding her breath, which was not a thing the Keth normally experienced, the breath-holding response being specific to species that used fear as a physical state. She noticed she was doing it. I want your people to understand something about mine, Adiz said at last. We've been a compact member for 14 months. In that time, 31 civilizations have done their analysis. They've run their projections. They've looked at our technology and our population numbers and our historical military capacity, and they've come to conclusions, reasonable conclusions, defensible conclusions. She paused. Wrong conclusions. And you believe our armada was the result of one of those wrong conclusions. I think the Dominion looked at humanity and saw a species that could eventually become a threat if left unchecked, and decided to resolve that before it became a problem. I think that was a rational decision based on the information available. Another pause. I also think it was the kind of rational decision that only makes sense if you've never actually met us. And now you want us to meet you. I want you to understand one specific thing, just one. Her voice shifted slightly, not harder, but more precise, the way a person sounds when they are saying something they have been thinking about for a very long time. We are not at the beginning of what we're capable of. We are not in our military infancy. We are not the species your projections modeled. What you encountered in this buffer zone, 8 outdated ships staffed entirely by volunteers, that was not the limit of what we could send. That was what we chose to send, because we wanted this conversation instead of the other kind. The silence stretched. What is the other kind? Vorith asked. And Adiz Akaffer said nothing for a moment that lasted exactly long enough to become its own answer. 3 days later, the recording of that conversation was presented to the full compact assembly, along with the tactical analysis of the buffer zone incident, and a supplementary report from the Dominion's own behavioral division that its authors had clearly written in a state of significant professional distress. The report's conclusions were not classified. They were distributed in full, as Keth Dominion law required for any incident assessment that affected compact security determinations. The document was 112 pages long. The relevant section was 11 words. We do not currently have a model that predicts this behavior with reliability. The Dominion's representative to the Assembly was a diplomat named Counselor Yeth Morin, who had been in this role for 30 years and had, in that time, delivered assessments of exactly 47 species. He was not a person given to visible emotion. The Assembly had, in fact, quietly discussed whether Yeth Morin experienced emotion at all. He stood at the address podium and read his opening statement in the flat, careful tone he always used. Then a human compact liaison named Commander Cira Vasquez raised her hand and said, "Counselor, may I ask a clarifying question?" "You may," Yeth Morin said. "Your report states that the 8 human vessels in the buffer zone were operating under command authority from General Akaffer, and that their orders were, and I want to quote this correctly, to engage the Armada using all available strategic options. Is that accurate?" "It is." and your analysis determined that those 8 ships possessed insufficient conventional military capacity to neutralize or repel the Armada under any standard engagement model. That is also accurate. So your own report is saying that General Akaffer sent 8 ships with orders to use all available strategic options, knowing they could not conventionally win, and they succeeded. Vasquez kept her voice completely neutral. What I'm trying to understand, counselor, is which part of that your behavioral model failed to predict, the success or the willingness to try. Yeth Morin was quiet for 4 seconds. Both, he said. That exchange was what Vorith would later identify in her private analysis of the entire incident as the moment she began to be genuinely afraid. Not of human weapons, not of human numbers or technology or any of the metrics she had spent her career assessing. She was afraid of something she did not have a technical term for. She went back to the recording of her conversation with General Akaffer. She had listened to it 6 times now. Each time, she found something she had missed. This time she found the pause after she had asked, "What is the other kind?" Meaning the other kind of conversation. There had been 4 seconds of silence from Akaffer's channel. Vorith had originally interpreted that silence as hesitation, as the general choosing her words. On the 6th listen, sitting alone in her command quarters at 300 station time, Vorith realized it was neither of those things. The pause was the answer. Akaffer had not been searching for words. She had been giving Vorith's imagination room to operate. She had known, with precision, that whatever Vorith's mind constructed in those 4 seconds would be more effective than anything she could say. A human general, in a military action conducted without firing a weapon, had also managed to conduct a negotiation in which the most significant communication was silence. Vorith sat in her quarters for a long time after that. In the morning, she filed a revised threat assessment for human military capability with Dominion High Command. The document was 40 pages. 37 of those pages were analysis, projection modeling, tactical consideration, and historical comparison. The last 3 pages she wrote in a single sitting, without pausing once, and sent to the Assembly Compact Security Council as an addendum marked urgent and unrestricted. Those 3 pages said, in essence, everything we thought we understood about human military capacity was measuring the wrong thing. The Dominion had assessed human weaponry, human ship tonnage, human population numbers, human reaction times and training protocols, and historical casualty tolerance in prior conflicts. None of those were the relevant variable. The relevant variable was something Vorith had been trying to find a technical term for since the conversation, and had finally given up on. She described it in lay language, which she had not done in an official document in 30 years. The humans we encountered were not operating within a threat calculus. They were operating within a values calculus. The distinction is critical and has no current analog in Dominion strategic modeling. A species that is making threat calculations can be deterred by superior force, because superior force changes the calculation. A species that is making values calculations cannot be deterred this way. Force does not change what they believe is worth dying for. It only changes how they die. She paused, then added, "I recommend we do not create a situation in which they are forced to make that determination at scale." The document reached the Dominion High Council 6 days after the buffer zone incident. It was reviewed by 17 senior strategists and flagged for further analysis, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of being set aside, while the institution tried to decide what to do with something it did not have a category for. Adiz Akaffer received a copy of it, through channels she had not used, sent by a person whose name she did not recognize, which was itself a message, 3 weeks after the incident. She read it alone in her office on the Abuja, which had returned to dock at Shepherd Station 7. The ship smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and a slight persistent electrical burn from a conduit that had been overloaded during the operation and not yet fully repaired. She had been meaning to get that fixed. She read the document twice. Then she set it on her desk and sat back in her chair, the old one, the worn one, and looked at the viewport, which showed nothing but dock framework and the edge of a cargo loader moving silently outside. Her executive officer, Major Kwame Asante, knocked on the open door. He was a tall man with a very quiet voice, and the ability to read a room that Adiz had come to rely on more than almost any other professional quality. "You look like you just read something that changed your mind about something," he said. "Possibly." She didn't look away from the viewport. "Quaim, do you know why I chose you for this mission? You asked for volunteers." "I asked for volunteers and then I personally selected from among them." She finally looked at him. "Do you know why I chose you specifically?" He was quiet for a moment. "I assumed experience." "Partly." She tapped the document on her desk. "It was also because you're the only person on this ship who, when I told everyone the full situation, 43 Keth ships, no backup, high probability of non-survival, you were the only one who asked not can we win and not what's the plan, but a third question." He waited. "You asked me what winning would look like." She looked back at the viewport. "You were thinking about it differently than everyone else was, and I needed that." "What does it look like?" he asked. "Winning. Now." She was quiet for a long time. "I think that's still being decided," she said. "Not by us." In the compact assembly, the buffer zone incident produced what diplomatic historians would later describe as a tectonic event, the kind of shift that does not announce itself loudly, but permanently and irrevocably rearranges the terrain of everything built on top of it. Humanity's provisional membership status was reviewed. The review took 9 days, involved 26 of the 31 member civilizations, and generated more formal diplomatic correspondence than any compact proceeding in 40 years. The Dominion, for the first time in their 400 years of compact participation, requested a bilateral meeting with the human delegation without preconditions. The meeting lasted 3 hours. What was said in it was never fully disclosed. What emerged from it was a joint statement, 7 sentences long, that both delegations read simultaneously in the assembly chamber. The 5th sentence read, "The Keth Dominion acknowledges that its assessment of United Earth's defensive posture and military intent was materially incomplete." The 7th sentence read, "Both parties agree that this incident demonstrates the necessity of direct and ongoing communication as a condition of regional stability." Commander Vasquez, who was present for the reading, later told General Akafer that the Keth delegation's lead negotiator had, at the conclusion of the reading, looked directly at the human delegation for a long moment before looking away. "What kind of look?" Adiz asked. Vasquez thought about it. "The kind you give something when you've realized you almost made an error that you cannot fully calculate the consequences of." The Abuja was decommissioned 14 months after the buffer zone incident. Budget constraints, aging infrastructure, reallocation of resources toward newer vessel classes. Standard administrative process. At the decommissioning ceremony at Shepherd Station 7, Adiz Akafer gave a short speech. She had written 3 versions and thrown all of them away. In the end, she stood in front of her crew, 214 people plus the families who had come, plus a compact observer delegation that included, unexpectedly, a Keth dignitary named Fleet Sub-Marshal Saravith, the same young officer who had operated the communications console on Vorith's command ship on the night of the incident, and she said almost nothing. "This ship is old," she said. "It always was. The computers were slow. The shields leaked. The number 3 engine had a vibration that engineering told me 17 times was within acceptable tolerance, and that I heard every night when I was trying to sleep." A small sound moved through the gathered crew. The sound people make when something is funny and also true, and also something else entirely. "We were never supposed to be the answer," she said. "We were never supposed to be the version of humanity that made the galaxy stop and recalculate. We were supposed to be 8 old ships with outdated weapons and not enough backup." She paused. "I think that's exactly why we were." She stepped back. She did not add anything else. Sub-Marshal Saravith approached her afterward in the small reception that followed. He was young, looked young, though Vorith had told her in a later correspondence that Saravith was considered a highly senior officer among his people, and the apparent youth was a biological characteristic of his caste. He stood in front of her in full Keth dress uniform, which was a great deal more elaborate than human dress uniforms, and he said nothing for a moment. Then, "Fleet Marshal Vorith sends her regards. Tell her I appreciate that," Adiz said. "She also asked me to give you this." He held out a small data chip. "She said it requires no response. She said to read it only if you want to understand what the incident looked like from where she was standing." Adiz took it. She did not ask what was on it. How is she? Saravith considered this with the care of a person choosing between several honest answers. She is someone who thinks differently than she did before, he said. She says this is uncomfortable. She also says she believes it is correct. Adiz turned the chip over in her hand. It was a standard Keth data format. She'd need an adapter. She'd find one. Sub-Marshal, she said. Can I ask you something, personally, not officially? You may. The night of the incident, you were on Vorith's bridge. You were there for the whole conversation. She met his eyes. What did it look like from where you were standing? He was quiet for a long time, long enough that she thought he might not answer. We had been trained, he said finally, to assess threats in terms of capability, what an enemy can do, what they can reach, what they can destroy, what they can endure. He glanced away briefly, then back. That night was the first time in my career that I encountered a threat that was not about capability at all. You had very little capability. What you had instead, he stopped, restarted. In my language, there is no single word for what you had instead. The closest approximation is a phrase. It translates roughly as the weight of a thing that will not stop. He held her gaze for a moment. I have been trying for 14 months, he said, to determine whether that phrase is a description of humans specifically, or of something that lives inside humans and uses them as its vehicle. He paused. I don't think I will figure it out, but I think the distinction matters. Adiz looked down at the data chip in her palm. She thought about 43 ships sitting cold and dark in a dust corridor. She thought about 214 volunteers who had asked not whether they could win, but whether it was worth trying. She thought about Fleet Marshal Vorith holding her breath, which was not a thing Keth normally did. She thought about the 3 pages of a threat assessment document that had stopped trying to use technical language. She thought about what winning looked like. She still wasn't entirely sure, but she had started to think it didn't look like ships or weapons or tactical geometry at all. It looked like a conversation on a private frequency that no one was supposed to be able to find. It looked like a 4-second silence that said more than any threat could. It looked like 214 people getting on a ship that smelled like burnt wiring and old coffee because something mattered more to them than the calculation. Somewhere out in the compact, 31 civilizations were recalculating. All of them were arriving at the same answer slowly in their own time, with the particular discomfort of a conclusion you cannot argue with. The humans were not the strongest species in the galaxy. They were not the fastest, or the oldest, or the most technologically sophisticated, or the most biologically durable, or the most strategically refined. They were the species that Fleet Marshal Vorith had put into 3 pages of plain language at 300 station time, because she could not find a technical term for what she had encountered. The species that Saravith still could not classify 14 months later. The species that looked from a distance like a manageable problem and looked from close up like something that had already decided what it was willing to pay and was simply waiting for you to understand that the number you named would not change the answer. Adiz pocketed the data chip. Outside the viewport, Shepard Station 7 turned slowly against the dark, and beyond it, the edge of the dusk corridor was just visible. A long, soft shadow across the stars where the Shepard's line began, where 8 old ships had once held position and waited, and where the galaxy had looked at humanity for the first time and seen not the limit of what they were, but the absolute certainty of what they would not stop being. The Abuja sat in dock for the last time. Its number 3 engine had finally gone quiet.